Go for it. What was happening with this picking basket?
Well, before I buckled this additional buckle that goes around the back here, when I was climbing the ladder, the weight of the apples would cause these clips here to unbuckle themselves, and then the apples were spilling out. So it's pretty important to clip this in the back as well before I just sling it over my shoulders. So that was, yeah, little insight.
Awesome. All right, so today we're going to be crushing and pressing some apples here. Let's take a look at the equipment we're going to use. So here's the base of the crusher. It has the top part off. We're just going to take a look at a few parts here. The spinning blade, of course, and a safety switch. So when we put the top chute on, the bolt that goes through will press this safety switch. So the chute has to be on for it to turn on. Sometimes if this doesn't turn on, it's because the bolt is not pressing the switch. So you'll leave the bolt where it is, and it should be in a good position to press the switch. In fact, let's put it on right now. So here's the chute, and after using it, it's really important to make sure it all gets cleaned and we get rid of all the apple residue that's inside the chute and also on the grinder part. One last thing is to make sure that this gray gasket is in place. If it's not, all of the apples spray out everywhere. So this is what makes the seal between the chute and the grinder. So when we put it on here, we need to make sure that this bolt, which should be tightened and set at the right depth, goes into the hole and presses the safety switch. There we go. And we'll tighten the 4 wing nuts. Great, all tight, still unplugged. So after we crush all the apples into 5-gallon buckets, which will just be under the chute there, the next thing will be to transfer them to the press. The press is run by water pressure from the hose. So this blue hose here is connected to the hose bib, and we'll turn that on when we are actually pressing. It goes into here, pressure regulator, it'll fill up this bladder, and then after we're done with the pressing cycle, we'll open this valve and all the water will drain out through this hose to a tree or the garden. So in order to fill the press, we'll put the basket on top. And it's important that the basket sits against the bottom here of the tray. If it's up like that, where you can see the lip, then all of the apples will fall out. Or while you're filling it, if you accidentally knock it like this, the apples will fall out of the bottom. You don't want the apples to fall into this tray because then they'll end up in your bucket of juice. So be careful that the basket stays in place while you're filling it. And so we'll fill the basket with the crushed apples from the grinder. And then once the apples get flush with the top of this metal ring right here, that's when it's full. You don't want to press them down, you just want to fill it up. You'll have some juice that's running out, so you definitely want a bucket that is really clean to be catching your juice right underneath there as you're filling the basket. And so you'll fill the basket. Once it's up to here, then you'll put the lid on. And similar to the bottom of the basket, you want to make sure that the lid fits into the basket perfectly all the way around. And then you'll tighten this onto the top. Not very tight, just enough to hold it in place. There we go, like that. And that is all of it put together. Now, let's see it in action. All right, so here we go. We usually fill up the 5-gallon buckets from the big buckets. It makes it much easier to transport. The grinder is plugged in, we'll turn it on, and there we are. One thing to note is that the apples usually end up on one side of the bucket here. And so as it fills up, we'll need to either rotate the bucket or scoop the pulp in the middle. one 5-gallon bucket of apples fills up, you know, half or 2/3 of a bucket of pulp, which is usually the easiest amount to transfer into the press. So come on over here and we'll transfer the first apples into the press. I find it's easiest just to turn the bucket over in the center so I don't accidentally tip the basket off. And then we can just push the apples off of the top. And the goal is to fill the basket uniformly. It takes like 6 or 8 buckets or something. And you'll see we're starting to get the first bit of free run juice into the bucket here. And now you can stop the video.
Go.
So we're gonna take a look now at grinding the apples and what can happen when we put the apples in too quickly for the grinder. Looks like it's stuck. So if the grinder gets clogged with the motor still spinning, we can give it a little shake to see if we can break it loose. Let's see. Perfect. And just to note, if it gets clogged and a little shake doesn't clear it, you will need to turn it off, unplug it, and reach in and take out the apples. And if there is a single apple that is down by the blade, if it's stuck against the blade with the blade off, then it usually won't be able to start on its own. So we need to either take that apple out by leaning this over and reaching in with it unplugged, or take the wing nuts off and disassemble it to remove the apples and then get started again. Usually 1 apple at a time, single file, pretty quickly is the right pace for getting the apples in. 1 bucket in maybe 30 seconds. So one thing with all of this equipment is it is dangerous. And so it is really important to wear the proper safety gear, probably some ear protection, certainly some eye protection. Here we go. Yeah, sometimes apples will fly back up here, so you want to make sure your eyes are protected. So here we go, we're going to process some apples. Okay, with this bucket, we'll fill up the basket press for this round of pressing. All right. So we'll kind of evenly spread all the apples around the top. And it's okay if there's a few leaves and stems, no problem. All right, there we go. We'll put the lid on top and make sure that it fits into the basket. There we go, all the way around. Perfect. And one of the nice things about the size of equipment here is that one of those full cans fills up this entire basket press once. It's usually 6 5-gallon buckets or 7 5-gallon buckets. And from each full basket press, we usually get between 10 and 12 gallons of juice.
went out?
I think it's actually still filming. Yeah,
Okay.
the screen does go blank. That's
Okay.
fine. Yeah, so from each of the full baskets, we'll end up with about 10 gallons, 10 to 12 gallons of juice. And that's the whole cycle. So this juice, if you want to keep it separately, is the free run. But I think the free run and the pressed juice is about the same and all totally delicious. So Ricardo, could you go turn on the water? So when we turn on the water pressure, first make sure that this valve is closed, as it is now. This is the water that would be going out. For the water coming in, we just turn it on gently, maybe one full turn or just 3/4 of a turn from off to 3/4 of a turn. So we want gentle pressing here. The pressure will build up until about 45 psi when the water will go out through this pressure relief valve. So if you let the water go in nice and slowly, you'll see the juice coming out around the basket. And I usually switch the buckets when they're about 2/3 full so that they're not overflowing. And we'll just keep, so it'll usually take about 3 5-gallon buckets that end up being 2/3 full for us to completely finish one round through the basket. And Ricardo, can you clean one more bucket? Here, how about this one? Let's just rinse that one out. That hose bib over there. Oh yeah, there you go. And you can take a look at the pressure gauge here. It stays close to 0 until you start to see juice come out pretty high up in the basket press. The other thing to do is the first time you're using it for the day, you can open this little valve on top to let any air out that's in the bladder. As soon as you see water coming out of here, once you see water coming out, then we'll close it. And you don't need to open it again until you're done for pressing for the day, and we're just draining it for storage. Okay, so once we start to get water coming out like that, we'll close this valve, and then we'll just leave it closed for the rest of the pressing day. We're ready for our third bucket here. So when we see the water start to come out from the pressure relief valve, we'll turn off the water at the hose bib. and then let it run for a few more minutes. As much patience as you have, you see we're still getting some more juice. One thing to be careful with, if you tilt the press to get the last bit of juice, it's good to scoot the bucket a little further underneath so that this bottom lip of the press doesn't just break the top of the bucket off. Yeah, a little bit of juice comes out through the top, but not very much. And so that's about it. This is one press worth of juice. Yeah, about 10 or 11 gallons we have here. And now it's time to disassemble the press, clean it, and get it ready for the next cycle. So here's what we're gonna do. The hose bib is off. So at this point, once we've decided that there isn't any more juice coming, which is about now, we'll open this valve. This hose, and it does leak a little bit because this threading doesn't quite match hose threading. So that's just something we'll have to deal with. But this hose is then run out to the garden somewhere downhill, ideally, of the press, and use it to water whatever tree. And it takes a few minutes, but not very long. So after about 1 minute of it draining out, enough pressure will be relieved from the top of the press that we can take the screw off. And we'll take the lid off. And let's take a look at the apples. So you can see that it presses the top of the apples into this thin layer here. You'll notice that the apples are quite dry after the pressing. And I'll just pull it away so we can see a little bit. And we let the bladder deflate just with going out through the hose until the walls of the bladder are basically vertical. And at that point you want to close this valve. You don't want the bladder to drain all of its water out and then collapse, because then it has too much space for apples and won't actually press the juice out of the apples efficiently. So as soon as you see the walls of the bladder vertical, then close the valve and just leave the water that's still in the bladder in there for the next cycle. So we'll keep an eye on that, but I think there's enough space now between the bladder and the apples that we can take the apples out, and we'll just watch it deflate without the basket on. So what we'll do is we'll just tilt the basket free. This is much easier with 2 people. And so we'll just tilt it up so you can get a hand, each person can get a hand underneath. We'll lift it straight up over the bladder and then lay it sideways into this container or wherever you want to put the apple hummus, and give it just a little tap and the apples will fall away from the inside of the basket, and you can just turn it over and they all fall out. And that's it. At this point, any apples that are on the outside of the basket we should clean off, but if there's a little bit left on the inside, it really doesn't matter because we're going to be doing several more cycles. So this is cleaned off sufficiently on the outside. And then the last thing to do before getting the press ready for one more cycle is to clean out all of the apples that are here around, especially around the trough. So here's our fresh juice. We don't want to get any more apples into the juice. So we're going to clean this up and we're going to put the juice wherever the juice is going to go, in our case into our fermenter in the barn, and give it a little rinse with the hose to get these last chunks of apples off, put the basket back on, and then we're ready for another cycle of grinding and pressing.